This episode contains depictions of violence that some people may find disturbing.
The 27th of January 2022.
Today, a nation's heart is breaking.
Police have today revealed further harrowing details about the death of Charlize Mutton in the Blue Mountains.
From news.com.au.
I'm Andrew Bucklow, and I've got news for you. The death of 9-year-old Charlize Mutton has shocked Australia. The little girl's body was discovered last week in a barrel on the banks of a river in New South Wales, with police this week revealing how she died.
And I can now disclose that the cause of death, Charlize, was that she suffered a fatal gunshot wound, and that's how she died. This is a unimaginable and egregious murder of a child.
Now, police have already arrested and charged Charlize's stepdad with her murder, but not all homicide investigations move this quickly. Today, we'll be joined by a former detective who'll explain how they go about catching killers, and he'll also open up about the most confronting case he's ever worked on. Dr Terry Goldsworthy has over 28 years policing experience in Australia as a detective inspector. He's now an assistant professor in criminology at Bond University. Dr Terry, thanks for coming on I've Got News for You.
Yeah, thanks for that.
All right, so when you get assigned a homicide, how on earth do you begin trying to solve the case? What are the first steps?
Yeah, look, I mean, generally there's some steps that apply to all homicides, securing the crime scene, things like that, making sure you obtain the best evidence that you can from what's available. But these investigations, as all major investigations or major crime investigations, are really a hunt for information. So police will move from a position of having little information or low information state, and then they're trying to move somewhere where they've got a lot of information or a high information state. So it's essentially an exercise in information management where investigators need to acquire information to build a plausible account of what has occurred.
And does the manner in which a person was killed give you a clue about who might have done it?
Look, it can. We know most murders or homicides in Australia are committed by people who are known to the victims.
Right.
So there's a hierarchy of suspicion, I guess. So you look at the most probable suspects, and you then attempt to narrow down the suspect pool, and that's what you do through the process of hunting for information. So investigators will do that by identifying, interpreting and assembling information and evidence that they obtain and putting that into a form to show who is responsible for the crime as such. And that includes things like crime scene material, use of intelligence databases, witnesses, victims and even the media.
I'm wondering how important are different types of information? Like, are witness statements worth more than forensic evidence, for example?
Look, they all have their own value. Forensic evidence, depending on the type of forensic evidence, such as DNA, for example, can be very individualistic, if you want to use that term. So it will identify a particular person. Other forensic evidence may be general in nature, such as a paint scraping or something like that. So witness evidence can be varied depending on how good the witness is in terms of what information they're providing. We know there are problems with human memory, but generally people get the basic story correct. It's the details where sometimes those things fall down. But, they all have their role in a criminal investigation, and they all come together to help police form those the pictures of what has occurred, looking for things like motive, modus operandi, how did the offence occur, all those type of things that will allow successful prosecution to take place.
Okay, so when you have suspects, I assume you bring them in for questioning. Can you now tell when someone is lying to you, given all your years of experience?
Look, I mean, we all have some intuition, I guess, where we think people might be lying to us. I'm not a body language expert by any means, and police don't pretend to be. But I think when you're bringing someone in, and I guess if you're looking at people who are involved in a homicide investigation, they may be the witnesses, they could be a person of interest. So, they may have been seen at the scene. So they're not yet a suspect, but there's someone who may well have knowledge of what occurred. And then the final kind of category is someone who's going to be a suspect. So when you get a suspect in for interview, the investigators should be well and truly prepared to question them. They should know all the background material in relation to that suspect, etc., like where they were and what was going on. So they should be able to tell if the suspect's giving a version of events that isn't correct.
Yeah.
They should have information that'll indicate that. And, a version of events from a suspect is just as powerful as a confession. A lot of people think you have to get a confession from someone. Well, you don't. If you can get a version of events that you can then show to be false, it's just as powerful as a confession.
All right. Well, speaking of that, what tactics do homicide detectives use in interrogations to try and get to the truth? Because on TV and movies, you always see the good cop, bad cop. But what do you guys actually use?
Yeah, look, I guess the first thing to point out is that really it's not an interrogation, it's an interview in Australia
right.
anyway. Certainly overseas in the UK, it often appears to be an interrogation, but over here it should be conducted as an interview between two people on an equal footing. Usually you'll have two people in there, so there'll be an arresting officer and what we call the corroborating officer. So while one is talking, the other should be taking notes, because these interviews, from my experience, having done many murders investigations, they can go for hours. So, part of the I guess the knack or the expertise is catching people out when they've told something different earlier in the interview. And then you can go back and say, there's an ambiguity here. You said you weren't at the 7-Eleven store, but you were, and you just said you were. So, it's all about that attention to detail in terms of, getting a version or getting information from someone. I often say to my students, and I used to say to my investigators that, you need to treat suspects, despite what you think they may have done, you need to treat them as a human and humanise the interaction, because generally, a suspect will be no different than anyone else. If you speak to them in a rude manner or mistreat them in terms of ignoring them and just not engaging with them, then it's highly likely when it comes time to interview, they'll replicate what you've done to them. So I always found that, speaking to the person, they may have just killed someone and you think they've done that, but you've got to speak to them as a normal person to make sure you get the best chance you can at getting evidence that will convict that person.
Now, Terry, during your career, you solved homicides and put those responsible behind bars. There must be just a huge sense of satisfaction when you get a conviction.
Yeah, it is. The arrest is only part of the process, and of course, that's all you ever see on TV. Usually the arrest gets made and they all go off to a bar or a pub to have a few drinks. That does occur. You do have a few celebratory drinks after, but it's really the beginning of the process, because the brief of evidence, which is what we call it, then has to be put together. And quite often you don't have the entire brief before you make the arrest. You have sufficient to arrest someone, but then you need to go and get all the other information. You need to have the forensic evidence, digital evidence, whatever type of evidence you've got there processed. You need to get statements of someone to put that evidence to the court. Every exhibit that you're going to enter into the trial must have someone who provides a statement to put it into evidence for the trial. So there's a lot of work around that to get it there. But yeah, it is satisfying to win homicide investigations in court. Of course, you don't win them all, but usually there's a high success rate with them.
Well, speaking of those ones that you don't win, have there ever been cases where you were certain that someone did it, but there wasn't sufficient evidence to convict them?
Oh, look, personally for me, no. Certainly there are cases where that's occurred, because I teach a subject on miscarriages of justice, and usually when we think that, we think of innocent people convicted, but in reality miscarriages of justice capture those ones where there's a factual certainty that someone committed it, but for some reason, be it technical reason or a problem with the admissibility of evidence, they've been found not guilty. And so even though you factually may be convinced to a very high level they've done it, the technicality will allow them to walk free. And, example of that would be someone who made admissions to, there was a case where a fellow admitted to strangling and raping his aunt to a covert operative, but the operative had obtained the evidence through telling a lie about certain evidence that was available against the suspect, and that evidence wasn't in existence. You just can't do that.
God, that must be so frustrating.
Yeah, it is. And that's why, you need to be very careful when you're going through these investigations. And, they move through stages. So you have a crime scene stage, initial assessment stage, an investigative stage, then you target, and then you arrest the suspect. And in those stages, there's a whole range of decisions and things like where it takes the investigative direction. There's tactical decisions as deciding what you should do and when and by whom. Like how many logistical resources do you put into the investigation? You would have seen that with, for example, Chloe Smith. They put a huge amount of logistical resources into that, and they came out with that result 19 days later. And I guess the final decision processes that go on are legal decisions where you need to make sure that whatever you do from the beginning of the investigation is legal and admissible down the track of the court case.
You were a policeman for almost 30 years. What's the most shocking homicide scene that you've witnessed?
Look, I think it was probably in terms of, I guess would be a triple murder that we had happen up here at Burleigh Head. So it was a security guard who was found at the end of a long weekend by some uniformed police. He was found in a toiletry area at a steel yard, an industrial yard. He'd been stabbed several times in the back and had his hands tied. And as we did the investigation, we then found other crime scenes extending out. His car was missing. We found that burnt out the back of the Gold Coast. We then sent police to his home to make inquiries as to why he wasn't reported missing. And we then found his wife stabbed to death. They had gone from the industrial yard to the house and killed her. And then we tracked the three offenders down the eastern seaboard of Australia, where they killed one of their own offenders in Victoria. So we had a triple murder eventually, and we had crime scenes all the way down the east coast of Australia.
And was that gang-related?
No, there was two individuals who had worked for this guy. He was a security manager, and they'd been several years since they'd worked for him, and they took a great dislike to him, and they were basically psychotic, and they came back up here and hatched a plan to rob him. They thought he had some money in his safe at home, and accosted him at the yard doing his security rounds, killed him, got the keys, went back, and got the wife to try and open the safe, etc. There was actually nothing in there, and then killed her, and then they turned on one of their own and killed him as well.
And those guys got put away?
Yeah, so both those guys are now in jail in Queensland doing life imprisonment.
When you see scenes like that as a homicide detective, do they have an effect on you and your mental health?
Oh, look, it's always confronting to see people who are dead, and I mean people who've died through violence as well. I mean, being attacked with a knife or a hammer, etc., things like that, or being shot do great damage to a human body. You just need to be respectful of the person who they were, and just make sure you apply yourself professionally to ensuring that their deaths won't go unanswered.
Terry, you saw some shockingly violent homicides during your career. I'm wondering, what's your opinion on the death penalty? I mean, it's obviously been abolished here in Australia, but would you ever want to see it come back?
Look, I don't know if it solves the problems. I mean, in basic facts, yes, that person won't offend again. But, I talk about this and that, when we talk about miscarriages of justice, because we know in the US a number of people have been killed with the death penalty who didn't actually commit the crime. So I guess the problem with the death penalty is that you'd have to be totally satisfied that the person had committed the crime. I think there are some circumstances where you probably could be satisfied to that level. But, at the end of the day, I mean, if you have prison sentencing regimes where life means life, we do now have some regimes in Australia where people who commit murders will never get out. I don't know if we necessarily need to go down that path of the death penalty.
Every now and then you hear stories about dumb criminals. They always make the newspaper, people who got caught easily due to their mistakes. Do you have any stories from your time as a cop?
Oh, look, I mean, yeah, I think it's probably a misnomer. I mean, there's a lot of smart criminals out there who put a lot of thought into what they do. But, yeah, there are some who, don't think about things. Like I can remember seeing video footage of an armed robbery where the fellow would come in and put a bandana over his eyes. So, he had to lift the bandana to see what he was doing. And then, of course, in the course of doing so, fully identified himself on the CCTV. So, the thought process into his disguise wasn't that great. You do see some people who, leave such an obvious trail that it's very easy for the police to track them down.
You've solved plenty of homicides throughout your career. Which one is your highlight? Which is the one that was the most satisfying?
Oh, look, I think they're all satisfying. I mean, I probably was involved in investigation of 25 plus homicides, and they all have their own, kind of importance to you as such. I saw, children kill their parents, parents kill their children, a whole host of dynamics in terms of the actual homicide relationships. I mean, they're all important. I mean, some homicides make the media for various reasons. The young children, homicides that are committed in a particularly nasty way. But in reality, every homicide is important as each other. It doesn't matter what, media attention the victim gets. The role of the police is to ensure that justice is served for all of them.
On the flip side, is there a case that still haunts you from your career?
Not really. I think I was pretty happy in terms of my strike rate in solving them. So there's not a big case that ever kind of hung over my head as saying that I should have got that solved. I mean, I have seen some cases that I thought should have been convictions that haven't been. And, at the end of the day, you just need to play the rule of the umpire. I mean, that's why we have a justice system and a jury system, et cetera, and you've got to accept the decision of that system, even though you might disagree with it. So I don't let that play on me at all.
Given you've put so many people behind bars as well, are you ever fearful of retribution from those people or their associates?
Oh, look, not really. I haven't. If someone had gone to jail who I didn't really think may have done it, I'd be worried. But no, I'm very confident that anyone I put in jail was responsible for the offence I charged them with. Otherwise, I wouldn't have charged them. But, I have run into, I charged a fellow with the murder of his wife. We never found a body. And, I ran into him walking down the street near my house one day. He was mowing the lawn and I heard his voice. And as soon as I heard the voice, I recognised it, turned around and there he was. So it didn't faze me. In fact, it just reminded me that I needed to go and see him because he's now out of jail. No one had told me. So I went to some other police and we went and saw him to see if he'd declare where the body was, but he wouldn't do it. So, occasionally you'll come across people you've arrested, especially if you stay in the police long enough, and, that's just life.
You're no longer part of the force. Do you miss it?
Oh, look, I miss certain parts. My last posting was in ethical standards in Queensland here in the police service, where essentially we were internal affairs and I was responsible for standing down, charging and, ultimately sacking police who had done the wrong thing. I don't think that was really what I joined the police for. So, when the opportunity came up at Bond, I was happy to get out there because it was, a decision about work-life balance, which I think most of us are now paying a lot more attention to, especially in the light of COVID.
Dr Terry Goldsworthy, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to I've Got News for You. I really appreciate it.
That's fine. Thank you.
I know this is pretty obvious, but just a reminder, if you are ever in an emergency situation, make sure you call 000. Okay, that's all we've got time for today. I'll catch you again tomorrow.